Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, we interview Dee Og, an Irish Republican and Irish language activist who works with Iskra Books and their Irish language imprint, Bradán Feasa. In this discussion, we talk about the Iskra Books publication, The Dark, Selected Writings of Brendan Hughes. Hughes was a former Irish Republican Army volunteer, political prisoner, and hunger striker. And while he is a revered figure in Irish Republican circles, well known in Ireland, as well as among those who have studied the Provisional IRA, some folks may also have become introduced to him through the book and FX Hulu series Say Nothing. In this episode, I talk to Dee about several of the Dark's writings, about the politics of Brendan Hughes, his internationalism, his solidarity with Palestinians, and his lifelong commitment to a 32-county socialist Irish republic. Along the way, we talk about Hughes' response to the so-called Good Friday Agreement, or as Hughes dubbed it, "Got fuck all," and his critiques of the political trajectory of Sinn Féin and some of its leaders, and more. We highly recommend that you check out this book from the comrades at Iskra Books. As with all of their work, there is a free PDF version you can download from their website, so check that out. But I also really recommend you ordering yourself a physical copy to support their work and add this beautiful book to your collection. I also just want to mention that if you're interested in conversations about counterinsurgency, Orasami Burton and I have released part one of a two-part conversation on Frank Kitson and his book Low Intensity Operations. For a brief period, Kitson was in charge of the counter-revolutionary campaign against the IRA, as well as counter-revolutionary wars in Kenya against the Mau Mau and in Malaya. We will link part one of that discussion in the show notes, along with some other discussions we've had about Ireland and Irish revolutionary politics over the years. And part two of our conversation with Orasami Burton about Kitson's low-intensity operations will be coming this Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on our YouTube channel. A link to that will be in the show notes as well. In addition to our conversation with Orasami Burton this coming Friday, we also have a conversation with Mark Neoclose tomorrow, Tuesday, the 18th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time on his new book, Pacification, Social War, and the Power of Police. We also have one this Thursday with James Kilgore on the new zine he's put together with Vic Liu entitled Lessons in Global Solidarity. As always, if you appreciate the work that we do with this podcast, the best way to support our work is to become a patron of the show. It's also the best way to follow all of our work. You'll receive an email with every episode, whether it's a YouTube episode or an audio episode, and you'll be notified when we're starting up any of our study groups, which you always have access to as a patron. You can become one for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. Take a minute and introduce yourself just quickly, give a little bit of sketch of who you are. We're going to be talking about the book The Dark, which is a collection of writings from Brendan Hughes that's published on Iskra Books, which good friends of the pod that we've done several conversations now on work that they published. So yeah, just say a little bit about, who you are, how you come to this text.
So yeah, my name's Donald. I'm from Ireland, living in Dublin born and reared, as they say. I'm an Irish language activist. I'm also dipping my toes into a little bit of journalism lately. I write for an Irish language newspaper called On Paper, which just means the paper. And general activist involved in, socialist Republican circles in Dublin throughout the past 5 to 10 years. And I came to Iskra Books maybe about 2 years ago or so at this stage, primarily because they had started to delve into kind of left-wing socialist Republican texts centering on Ireland. And The Dark was one of the first books that they put out strictly about Ireland. And it's, as you said, it's centering on the writings of Brendan Hughes, who this is all going to be about. Yeah, that's how I came to be with Iskra Books, just by Irish language stuff as well. We have a new, I'll probably plug that maybe at the end as well, but we have a new imprint, which is going to be called Bradán Feasa. It's going to be publishing things in the Irish language. And I'm working on a book at the moment about the struggle for Irish medium education through the 70s right up until 2023. So there's some exciting stuff coming out, but that's Iskra Books, and that's myself. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. To start, give us a little bit of a biographical sketch of who Brendan Hughes was and why he remains an important figure within Irish republicanism. And folks who are listening to this, they may have seen or may not have seen, there's a new series that's kind of put out by Hulu and I think FX that's a representation of the book Say Nothing, which, deals a little bit with him, a little bit with Dolores Price and Jerry Adams and others across several years. But anyways, start with a bit of like who he was through some of his actions, his role within the Provisional IRA, and some of the things that made him a prominent figure within that movement.
Yeah, so a bit about his biography. He was born in 1948 to a Catholic family on the Falls Road in Belfast. Anyone who knows Belfast, for international people who haven't been to Belfast, it's kind of divided. It's a city divided. So it's in West Belfast, and the Falls Road is a staunch Catholic, Republican, nationalist area. And just maybe a few hundred meters away is the loyalist, unionist Shankill Road. So it's actually interesting where he grew up on the Lower Falls itself was kind of like a little Protestant enclave within this Republican area. And all of the neighbours kind of assumed that the family were Protestant, but couldn't be further from the truth. They were a staunch Republican family. His grandfather lost an arm during the War of Independence in the 1920s. Belfast saw some serious fighting during the 1920s. And both of his parents served time for various IRA membership and related activities. His father's full name was Kevin Barry Hughes. He's named after the young IRA volunteer who was hanged in Dublin during a skirmish. He was found underneath a lorry by British soldiers, and he had a revolver, so he was hanged. So yeah, staunch Republican family. And it's interesting when the kind of the tension which led to the time known as the Troubles, when that was brewing first, Brendan Hughes wasn't actually in the country. He served in the British Merchants Navy, which was a common, escape for some people to earn a wage, make a living, go out and see the world. And in some of his writings, he says that he visited South Africa and he got to see the system there, the apartheid. And he wrote that when I left South Africa with the Merchant Navy, I became a socialist. That really shaped him. And then 1969 is really when it all kicks off. As they say, there was riots, pogroms. In Derry, you had the Battle of the Bogside, where police and loyalist militia tried to enter a dominantly Catholic area, and people came out to resist that, build barricades. And that's where the famous "You are now entering Free Derry" comes from, that big wall, the kind of like a liberated zone, if you want to think of it like that. So he comes back in 1969 and he's approached from his cousin, Charlie Hughes, who was in the IRA, and he actually died in the conflict. There's a memorial to him on the Falls Road. There's lots of murals and various figures who are famous. They get a place on the wall. And Charlie Hughes, the person who brought Brendan into the IRA, he's there as well. And quickly he rises through the ranks. He's a very jovial, light-hearted character, and he rises through the ranks. He becomes what's known as the OC, the officer commanding. It's interesting with the IRA, there's no like private, sergeant, corporal, there's none of that. Everyone's a volunteer except for the person who's in command. They're known as the OC. So he became OC of D Company, West Belfast, or they have a nickname, they're called the Dogs. And he's famous, revered in Republican circles. Even when the conflict was happening, he escaped from Longkesh, a big internment camp, in the back of like a garbage truck, essentially, and went on the run. And he had like a pseudonym as like I forget what the pseudonym was, but his cover was he was a traveling toy salesman. He's door to door, and his various activities would take place under that cover. And yeah, if anyone ever goes to Belfast, he's on all the walls. If you ask anyone from the local area, like, who's your hero, it's generally Brendan Hughes, Brendan the Dark Hughes, as he's known, because he had a very tanned complexion. So yeah, that's a little bit about his biography and what he got up to during the conflict.
Yeah, thank you. So let's move into some of his ideas, because, it is a book, as we said, it's his writing. So it's not really a book that's like a biography or about his exploits as a revolutionary. It's about the things that he said and wrote, positions that he took, And a lot of it is, of course, particularly after and in response to what's known as the Good Friday Agreement, which he had a different name for, as well as the rise of Sinn Féin as a kind of political party from the context of the Provisional IRA's armed struggle. So what are some of the ideas and positions that you think make him important figure as a thinker, which is to say, why publish a book of his writings too?
Why I think he's important is to a lot of people like myself. I've a working class upbringing as well. The texts that really jump out at me, that obviously we read Marx and we Engels and a lot of these, very academic, like it might be a little bit difficult to grasp sometimes. Maybe a reading circle or something is needed. But the likes of Fred Hampton and Mao, I put Brendan in there as well. It's really accessible. Now, not to say simplistic, because at times we're going to be talking about some of his other works shortly. It's this really artistic, beautiful way of talking as well. And you can tell that despite his working class upbringing, this is a really learned man. He really has a different kind of education, not a traditional education. But why he's important as a thinker, definitely to Republicans, is that he was one of the first who was brave enough, I suppose, to speak out against the winding down of the conflict, or the peace process, as people call it. Usually, if you say you're against the peace process, you sound like a maniac, But he was against the kind of what he identified as a sellout. So in some of the earlier stages of the book, he talks about, in an interview, a man called Joseph O'Connor. Joseph O'Connor was someone who didn't go along with the Provisional IRA's ceasefire and their winding down, and he joined a splinter group called the Real IRA. And one night he was sitting in his car outside. I think he was going to a meeting or something like that, but he was mysteriously removed and shot. And the police force, Belfast is one of the most militarized police forces in the world. They had no idea all of a sudden. So he spoke out really harshly against the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin, in that they had principles at one point. The principles were a complete British withdrawal from Ireland and a 32 county socialist republic. But all of a sudden they start saying things like, we need to work towards this through, engagements and going into the government and getting votes and all of this stuff. And at the same time, through one part of their mouth, they were saying, we're of the working class. We represent these people in some of the worst areas in Europe, some of the most impoverished areas in Europe. But at the same time, they're wearing Armani suits. They're driving the best cars. They're having meetings in 5-star hotels, whereas a mile down the road, people are going hungry at night and things like that. So that's why I think he's important as a thinker, as a writer. He was able to identify this earlier on. Maybe he was the bravest as well, because, a lot of people would have had this opinion, but in Joseph O'Connor's case, he spoke out as well, and he was killed for it. So yeah, Brendan took that first step.
Yeah, thank you. So one of his pieces, we're going to go through a few different of the interventions that he makes in the book. So there's a piece called Dances with Buffaloes, where he talks about, quote, the race to catch up with the great capitalist buffalo, end quote, and this being an infectious thing. And he later calls capitalism the greatest cheat of all. And so can you talk a little bit about his criticism of capitalist ambitions and how he felt that the capitalist ambitions that he saw within the Republican movement, especially after he got out of prison, that these were a betrayal of the place that he fought for?
To say at first, it's probably one of his most artistic pieces as well. Like I was saying beforehand, that he could write very simplistic so that people could understand what he's saying. But at the same time, he paints a picture in what he's saying. Dances with Buffaloes. I think it's just a really beautiful piece. I think what he's getting at essentially in it is, you could look at it a few different ways. It's capitalism versus barbarity almost. He's talking about these people. Capitalists like to think of themselves as very civilized, prim and proper ladies and gentlemen, but their position and how they got to be there in the first place was through the result of horrific crimes and theft and connivance and things like that. And he's kind of saying that for some people, they have that, want to climb the ladder and to, to be on the hamster wheel and to get there eventually. But by doing that, you're, feeding into this system which just destroys and leaves behind deaths and destructions. It's a really poignant criticism of capitalism. I really like how he did it. I found it interesting as well how he compares capitalism to a buffalo as well. I was trying to think of what the symbolism is there as well, because obviously the buffalo is like sacred to indigenous people and was almost wiped out as well in America. I wonder what he was going at there. It's kind of civilization versus barbarism. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I was thinking about that earlier on today.
Well, it's interesting. Do you remember when that piece was written?
Yeah, it just says winter 2000.
2000, yeah. I mean, there was a movie that was called Dances with Wolves, and within that movie, there's a whole, I haven't seen it in a number of years, and it's problematic in a few different ways, but like it does deal with the slaughter of the buffalo by settlers in the Americas too, and so that may have been a partial influence there. Within the film, I would say there is a critique of, as I said, kind of problematic in certain ways, but there is a critique of settler colonialism, I think, within the film, and you could connect that, I think, as well to capitalism and this idea of, just kind of conquering nature. I mean, if I recall, there's just a scene in the movie, just there's a mass slaughter of buffalo, and there's like people who kill them, they don't even take all the meat or anything like that. And so it's like just kind of wasteful and not thoughtful at all about like kind of ecology or, the web of life, I guess you could say, right? And how these things are connected to each other. And so, I don't know if that was a influence in him in some ways of just thinking about, as you say, the way that capitalism and capitalists, it seems like you're getting ahead or whatever, but it really just supports like one or two people at the expense of, hundreds or thousands of others. And, so, or millions, but, whatever at the scale that you're doing it at. So I don't know if that's related, but I agree the piece is a beautiful one.
Definitely, yeah. And I suppose he could have definitely been comparing this to the few in the party as well who are trying to get their seat at the table, because it's a bit of an infection in Irish politics as well as politics in other countries, that you have the career politician who gets in and that's them set for life. They have the big pension coming when they retire, and they forget about their constituents or why they went into politics in the first place. I'm sure it's a comparison there to what he calls the Armani Soup Brigade, the party hierarchy who are very happy to be wined and dines.
Yeah. I mean, and this gets into the next question, which I did want to talk a little bit about the Armani Soup Brigade, but also just broader, like some of I think what he identifies as sort of class divisions within republicanism, again, particularly as he gets out of prison. There's an episode that he kind of recalls a few different times in the writings of, I think they're called the Rogue Builders, but, going to work for this company, basically getting paid, really low, like below minimum type wages, and them being supported because they're Republicans, I guess, or are having this business because they're Republicans, and he makes reference that I think that there's a project they're working on Falls Road. And then alongside that, he has what you talked about is this critique of the Armani Soup Brigade within the leadership of Sinn Féin. And so can you talk a little bit about some of his critiques of, maybe how you start to see class divisions within the Republican movement more after the armed struggle period?
Yeah, definitely. I think at first what we need to say is that Brendan himself, like sometimes you hear like definitely middle class or kind of petty bourgeois revolutionaries who are talking about we need to make inroads into these communities. We need to see what the issues and identify the issues. He was working class. He wasn't this kind of middle class person from the outside. He lived, breathed, and walked the walk in Belfast. So the problems that are affecting the communities there were also affecting him. As we saw, he gets out of prison and he wants to find work on this building site, and they're paying way below minimum wage. And the most ironic thing as well is that he says he remembers his father talking about another veteran Republican who only died back in 2021 from the same company that Brendan was in, called Billy McKee. He was like born in 1920. He saw several different struggles. Brendan's father said that when Billy McKee got out of prison, the same thing happened to him. And then in the book, Brendan says, here I am years later, having got out of prison, and my own people are paying me peanuts, as he calls it. He's getting absolutely nothing. So I think it definitely showcases the class divisions there. And there was a kind of thought that, to some extent, political education wasn't, not everyone engaged in it. In Sinn Féin, definitely, like, there was this kind of thought that because these people are Republicans, nationalists, they're going to be okay, they'll be fine. But as we know, just because you belong to a certain community doesn't mean you'll necessarily have the best politics. He identifies that there's going to be people with that tendency in every community. And if Sinn Féin had, I don't know, better political education and maybe some criticism or self-criticism, that these issues could have been identified, but these people were just left to run rampant. And, you could still argue to this day in Belfast there's predatory companies who are seizing on people, or even landlords as well, who would say, I'm a Republican, I believe in a 32 county Ireland, but I'm, taking 1/3 of this person's pay every month. So yeah, it's definitely Brendan at his most critical. There's one of the interviews there where the interviewer is saying he finds it hard to keep his critiques not from getting personal sometimes, but because he was so close to the leadership as well, and because he was like best friends with Gerry Adams, even up until his death, I think he kept a picture of the two of them when they were in prison. And the interviewer said, why not take that down? And he said, I can't, I'm too sentimental, I have to remember the good old days. But yeah, he definitely is a little bit bitter in this piece. And you would be as well, you've spent 20 years, 30 years of your life fighting for national liberation. You spent years in jail, and then you come out and these people who are meant to be on your side are robbing you blind.
Yeah, absolutely. Hughes doesn't talk he doesn't talk a great deal about this in the book, but he does discuss in certain pieces the British role in molding a leadership that he says they could deal with. And he talks about this both in the context of the role of imprisonment and releasing certain people, and how the British operated, later than how the British operated towards Sinn Féin in the 90s, as we started to talk about what you outlined as, the peace process or the winding down of the armed struggle. So talk a little bit about, if you can, his analysis of the role of British counterinsurgency in terms of producing an opposition that it could work with or even control to some extent. And beyond Hughes's opinion, I'm curious too of what you think about this argument.
Yeah, he doesn't go too much in depth into it, I suppose, because he was still in regular contact with some of these people. To come out with such a statement like that, it's kind of, it's quite dangerous for the time. And also, you could be brought to court for defamation if you're just putting things out like that. But definitely there is a bit of truth to this, because I was reading a few books in preparation for this, and they deal with people who were against the winding down or the going towards, the selling out of the struggle as they saw. So one of them is Unfinished Business, and it's by Marissa McGlinchey. And the second one is called The Legion of the Rearguard. I'll find out the author for you before the end of this. And in it, they state that certain documents were leaked from the British, where British intelligence say, we're in no position to successfully defeat the IRA. It's impossible. Like, you can't defeat a guerrilla force who have the hearts and minds of the population there. You take these people out and 4 or 5 more will just show up. Kind of what's happening in Gaza at the moment. If you oppress a people so much, if you brutalize them, you humiliate them, and these people see this every single day, you're contributing to recruitment into this guerrilla force. So what they say is that we need to approach this a little bit differently. And this is where you've several different figures, and probably the most famous that people know is a man called Freddie Scappaticci. He was a key figure in the IRA's internal kind of intelligence. His job was to find out moles and to take them out. I think they're called the Internal Security Unit. The Internal Security Unit. So informers or anyone who's working for the British, he was charged with taking them out. It came out in the early 2000s that Freddie Scappaticci was the double agent. The guy in charge with internal security for the IRA was working for the British. So he disappeared a lot of people who would have been really diligent Republicans, true and true, would never have gone wrong or betrayed anyone. So he removed all of these key figures or strong fighters or big personalities. So definitely, if the British are looking at, can we mold a leadership that we could deal with? If you look at key figures, why aren't they taken out? You know, and how come they're still not, either they didn't go to jail for too long or they weren't assassinated, like a lot of key figures or even strong fighting units in the IRA. Like one that springs to mind is there's an ambush that happens in the 80s in a town in Loughgall, and it's the East Brigade of the IRA, the East Tyrone Brigade, and they were looking to kind of emulate what the IRA were doing during the War of Independence, i.e. founding these things called flying columns. A flying column is a unit of 20 men, and they go out into the countryside, they live in the countryside, they're mobile day and night, and they're engaged in combat all the time. This wasn't really a thing during 69 to 1998. You kind of had people had a day job, and then maybe they would, maybe have a different identity. But all of those guys were taken out by the SAS. The SAS knew exactly where these guys are going to be. They had a kill zone, and then they came into sight and they're taken out. And I think the families are still looking for justice to this day. There's been no inquiry. And how did people know where they were going to be? And there's also questions as well as the former leadership of Sinn Féin as well. Certain figures that just abandoned all principles and were happy enough to decommission weapons, which had never happened before in the history of the IRA. It was always dump weapons for another day. So in the 1920s, after the Civil War, the anti-treaty IRA said, we're going to stash these weapons because a day might come where the Irish people might need them. And the same happens in the 1960s. There was another campaign, but this was the first time. And a lot of veteran Republicans are really, really angry about this, that the IRA never handed over their weapons or never destroyed them. And that was allowed to happen. Yeah, there's a lot of different critiques, but you could definitely see that the British were really happy with the situation that happened, that came about. And also certain leaders as well who would have been seen as hardliners. I'm thinking of a man called Rory O'Bradick. So there was kind of the equivalent of a national meeting within Sinn Féin in 1986. And Rory O'Bradick was against the dropping of abstentionism. Sinn Féin never sat in any of the parliaments. They saw them as foreign imposed parliaments in Dublin, Belfast and in London. But throughout the 80s, the leadership, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, started proposing, why not go into parliament? We can argue the case here. And it became there was a bit of a split going to happen. There was to be a vote on whether to drop abstentionism. And there's a very famous speech of Rory O'Bradick saying that as soon as you enter that house, as soon as you put your name to the roll of proceedings, they can control you, they can box you in, and you won't be able to get anything done. And then the vote wasn't fair at all. There was different kind of orgs. Like, in order to have a vote, you have to be like a Cumann. You need to be in charge of a certain area. Mysteriously, there was more in favour of abstentionism than against. So Rory O'Brady, a Republican hardliner, again revered in Republican circles, he split to found Republican Sinn Féin, who are still around. RSF is what they're called. And Sinn Féin then went down the slippery slope of entering into Parliament and sitting down and discussing with politicians. And you could argue that it begins in 86 when they take their seats in Dublin, because then in the 2000s, they take their seats in Belfast, they enter into power sharing, and who knows about London. They still abstain from Westminster because the north of Ireland is technically, within the UK. So they don't see that as a legitimate parliament. But who's to tell? A lot of principles have been abandoned. So, you never know.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned this a little bit earlier on, but a couple of other struggles that come up in this text are the South African struggle, which, as you mentioned, he visited South Africa, and then the Palestinian one as well. And, I have another question a little bit later on, I think, about the Palestinian struggle, but how do you think that Hughes understood these kind of 90s era, 90s comes this era of sort of peace processes. He's like, you have the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and a lot of these movements, especially the ones that had a kind of socialist character, they kind of feel a need to sort of fit into this new reality. And this creates a context in which you have a number of peace processes occur. You have the Irish one, the Oslo Accords, and the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa go on. And it certainly seems in the text that he draws connections between these processes.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, definitely. And the key thing as well, as he was a learned man, he would identify what do all of these three struggles have in common, or these three countries. They're all settler colonial entities, like Northern Ireland, Palestine, South Africa. So I think that's why there's such solidarity between those three countries as well, because, they had a population who are not indigenous to the area, who are propped up by big foreign powers with interests in the area. They entered in, displaced people. It's often oversimplified as well. A lot of people think like the conflict in Palestine is about religion. The same was said about the conflict in the north of Ireland as well. All Protestants just hate Catholics and vice versa. And that's it. It's really simplified. But I think Brendan identifies that the key issue here is settler colonialism and capitalism. Like, sure, I think he says it at one point, you can take the gun out of Irish politics, but it's the working classes giving the guns up. The police force, British Army, they all retain their power, whereas it's just a complete sellout. So yeah, he does talk about Palestine. He talks a little bit about Iraq and South Africa. We can get into that in a little bit. But yeah, he had massive, as a lot of Irish people do, massive respect for the Palestinian struggle. And that's historical. That goes back like 18, 90 years. During the hunger strikes, Palestinian prisoners were sending solidarity messages to the men on hunger strike and vice versa. And I think to this day as well, Kurdish hunger strikers or Turkish hunger strikers, I think they take vitamin tablets, but if they're going to just take water, they say, oh, we're doing it the Irish way. That's become something to them. Like, oh, we just drink water. We're doing it how the Irish used to do it. So there's massive respect between all three countries, definitely. If you ever go to Belfast, I highly recommend anyone listening to go to Belfast, do a tour of the Falls Road, even the Shankill Road as well. You'll see there's an international wall. So you have the Basque Country, the Second Spanish Republic from the Civil War. A lot of people from Belfast went over to fight. And you'll see Palestine, South Africa, like Mandela's there. And you have Leila Khalid, she's there. Oh, it's really, really cool. Eye-opening as well. Just the people of Belfast and the north of Ireland in general, as an oppressed people, they get it. They've never, like, maybe some of them haven't read as much as some of us, but they get what basic internationalism is. I think Brendan says at one point in the book, here we were on hunger strike. These lads who we had never heard about and had never met were sending us solidarity messages. and were worried about us because we were on hunger strike. There's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And he continues, to follow these different struggles too, all the way to the end of his life. And there's a comment on page 84 in the text where Hughes is talking about, as you mentioned Kurdish prisoners. He's talking about the struggle of the Kurdish prisoners in Turkish prisons who were on hunger strike. And he notes that the Sinn Féin line on this was, quote, "We do not get involved in the internal politics of another country," end quote. And it's a line that really seems to disgust him as a rejection of any obligation towards solidarity with oppressed people's struggles. And, I know across Ireland and within ordinary Irish Republicans, and as you mentioned, in the North, that at a grassroots level, as you kind of were talking about, there are a lot of feelings and expressions and understandings of solidarity with Palestinians and their struggle. And I'm curious, though, part of the problem that I could foresee, I'm sure other people have talked about this more, is that, you have Sinn Féin that takes on a specific role in this peace process and is kind of seen as the legitimate heir to the nationalists' struggle, right? The legitimate embodiment of this within parliamentary politics. And that the analogous sort of entity within Palestine would be the Palestinian Authority, right? Which, of course, is widely seen by this phase of the Palestinian resistance as, having capitulated and basically collaborating with Israel, right? So I was curious about kind of, in the period Brendan's writing, but also today, about the dynamics of Sinn Féin with Israel and the Palestinian Authority as opposed to, the resistance factions, groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or PFLP today.
I think they wouldn't go near them groups, to be honest. I think they're in power sharing in the north, and they have so how it works, there's not a prime minister, there's a first minister and a second minister. So it's usually the larger of the nationalist or unionist parties. Whoever's the larger gets to be the first minister. So at the moment it's Michelle O'Neill. She's the head of Sinn Féin in the north, and then the second minister is someone from the DUP. I'm not too sure, the unionist party. So they're in government in the north of Ireland, and in the south for the past number of years. There's been a lot of momentum. A lot of people are looking to them as this kind of radical big solution to the housing crisis, and they didn't get in this time, but they're really trying to clean up their image. They want to get into power. They want to appear as respectable to middle class voters who are terrified of the name Sinn Féin because they associate them with guys with balaclavas. So I don't think they would go near the likes of Hamas or PIG or the PFLP. I think that they definitely wouldn't. But it's really ironic as well that they're so friendly with the Palestinian Authority, that they went through the exact same thing. They, the PLO, essentially, they had their own freedom struggle, and then they just entered into, working with the Israelis, and now actually, pressing out dissent, like shooting at Palestinian protesters or raiding houses and things like that. It's one of history's ironies, I think on the ground here, and there's a sizable Palestinian population here, and they've been trying to say to us, and there was one lady in Belfast who went to a Sinn Féin public meeting, where they had a Palestinian Authority member, and she stood up and she disrupted the meeting. And the behaviour from some of the Sinn Féin people was awful. It was this lady in her 20s, young lady, and these guys in their 50s and 40s are just manhandling her and pushing her out the door. It's definitely like a fall from grace, That's my opinion on it. A lot of the more radical parties here or organisations would be, they would definitely support the Palestinian people's right to resist under international law. It was actually really refreshing. One of the parties in Parliament, he got up, a guy called Richard Boyd Barrett, like a respectable politician. They say they're socialists, they're left wing kind of, I have no real faith in party politics, but this guy got up at one of the national demos and he said, Palestinian people have a right to resist by any means necessary under international law. It was really refreshing to hear. You hear politicians say that, like, just saying that, you know, what's happening is awful and they are allowed to pick up weapons to defend themselves because they are going to die. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's one of the things that we've tried to make sure that we state over and over again in our work. And it is, clear under international law. And yet, unfortunately, this is where international law is a bit of whatever the United States says it is, at least in our context in the US, where, that's not even a view that, I can't imagine a US politician, saying that, and yeah, I mean, and it's sad, I think, that some of those things that were so clear in the height of the anti-colonial period, even though obviously, I mean, the UK, Thatcher and all them, they always denied the right of, say this is terrorism and, deny the right of Irish people to resist. But, it was something that there was a lot more support for on an international level. There are so few states or nations or politicians, even globally, that are willing to say that these days about Palestinians. And yet it's quite obvious. I mean, if you have, tanks and things like that coming through your neighborhood, like, how could you deny those people the right to resist those, And I think that's why, too, at least in the US, like, they never show any videos of the Palestinian resistance actions. Like, you have to go find those for yourselves because they don't want to raise those questions of, like, actually, it's perfectly legitimate for these people to be attacking these soldiers, in these tanks and things like that. So
you also mentioned, I found it really interesting, and I wanted to highlight the kind of hypocrisy as well. That quote you said, we do not get into the internal politics of another country. I find it really, really ironic that came from people in Sinn Féin as well, where in the early 2000s, as you mentioned, it was the kind of winding down of all of these post-colonial resistance movements. The people who helped negotiate the ceasefire, the decommissioning of weapons in the Basque Country in northern Spain was one Cherry Adams. So I find it so interesting that, on one hand, when Brendan is talking about this solidarity with another country, that they're saying this, but on the other hand, when another country wants to give up and just essentially surrender, he's on the plane, he's over there helping them out. I thought that was just a little bit ironic. I wanted to raise that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you for making that point. So talk a little bit about, this is an interesting part in the book. And it's interesting too, because I lived in Ireland for a semester. I did a semester at National University of Ireland in Galway.
Oh, nice.
But this is way back. I'm going to date myself. This was in 2003. And so it was right. I remember one of the things that I always remember is, like, every Irish person, when I would meet them, they would say, "Did you vote for George Bush?"
Cool.
because they were so, they knew how ridiculous the war on terror was that the U.S. was leading, and, the way that the United States was responding to 9/11. And so anyways, I found it just interesting, again, to go back and to read what Brendan had written about the U.S.-led war on terror post 9/11. Any thoughts from that you'd like to share?
Yeah, he has a whole piece on it. I'd love to read it. But also as well, he was a lifelong member of, I'm not too sure when they were founded, but he was a very, very prominent member of the Irish Palestinian Solidarity Committee. And they would regularly organise buses from Belfast to Dublin for the National March. The National March happens occasionally when people from all over Ireland travel to the capital. And it's a big, big show of, look, what's happening is wrong, immoral. And so around the same time, 2003, 4, 5, as well as there being demonstrations for Palestine, there was big anti-war demonstrations like there was in America. It happened here as well. And there's always been that strong anti-war movement here, going back to Vietnam. Like, I remember seeing pictures of people protesting outside the American embassy in Dublin in the 60s, and a few of them with, like, Vietnamese flags, like the NVA army flags. It's It's a big center of anti-war, despite the government's where our government is trying to get rid of our neutrality and have us join NATO. But that's another story. But yeah, he writes a whole piece on Palestine and Iraq. You mind if I read it?
Yeah, no, that's great.
So he said, Palestine and Iraq, this was written 16th September 2002. Iraq looks set to face a war waged upon it by America and its main ally, the Brits. I have no doubt that Saddam Hussein is a brutal thug who deserves to go, but he is not on his own. George Bush would have us believe that the war criminal Ariel Sharon is a man of peace. That was the Israeli prime minister at the time. How much crap are we to plug into our ears and allow it to stop us hearing the cry of the innocents pounded by American bombs? Telling us that Sharon is a man of peace is like telling us Hitler was a humanitarian. The war about to be fought is not about removing injustice. It is about putting some other bastard in to replace Saddam Hussein, so long as he is a bastard that won't threaten US interests. How many more people will we in the West allow to die before this fact hits home? If something is right, we should support it, but where it is wrong, we must oppose it. What is happening to the people of Palestine is wrong. What is happening to the people of Iraq is wrong. Saddam Hussein is a tyrant, according to Mr. Bush, but Ariel Sharon is a man of peace. How about taking some action against him? 10 of my friends died during the hunger strike. They received much support from the Palestinians. They didn't even know us, but they could identify with us. Have we paid them back in kind? I don't think so. Have we watched the injustice inflicted upon them while our leaders have flirted with Washington? The Irish people need to speak out on the Palestinian question. They need to speak out against the US government who are about to bomb Iraq, because while they bomb it, Sharon will be sticking the boot into the Palestinians. Justice is true. Injustice is a big lie. And the big lie facing us today is one that condemns Iraq and excuses Israel. I think that could be written right now, like talking about Yemen in place of Iraq, or Iraq is still being bombed occasionally as well because they're supporting the resistance in Palestine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So can you talk a little bit about his piece, Hitler Speaking Hebrew, he writes, which is written way back in 2002, which, again, as you said with that last piece, encompasses, I think, a lot of the way that I, and I'm sure many of us feel today about Zionism and its genocidal war on Palestinians, and just a general, I think what has been exposed in these last 15 months, right, is the kind of genocidal character of Israeli society. So talk a little bit about this piece as well as other writings about Palestine and the region, if you want to, that he goes into in the book.
Sure. I'd like to say maybe a year ago, I think this awful genocide is going on well over a year and a half now at this stage. I think my maths might be off there. But I remember myself going to one of the national marches for Palestine in Dublin, and it was to be the big one. It was, I think, 60, 70,000, which is massive for Ireland and people on the left. But I knew that I saw the Belfast contingent when I saw a placard and it said Hitler is now speaking Hebrew. So that's the kind of impact that Hughes still has on people. He wrote that in 2002 and it might as well be true to this day. I think when this all started, I'm not too sure what your thoughts about this are, but you had a lot of liberal-minded people who were saying like, oh no, you shouldn't be making comparisons such as that, like diminishes the Holocaust and it's not fair, or even saying that that's anti-Semitic and things like that. But I think at this stage, when we've seen people in tents being firebombed, little, like, I'm sorry to say, but like little children decapitated and stuff like that, that is stuff of horrors that we could never have envisioned before 2023. It's the modern version of what happened back in the 1940s. And even in 2002, when things like weren't as bad as what's happening in 2023 up until this point now, I think it's fair to call a spade and to say, a once oppressed people have gone to, it also ties into generational trauma as well. I think you could read into that as well, that they have now become the oppressor. And he goes a little bit into it as well. Yeah, so he's talking about, he's at home and he's in bed and he hears a big banging on the door and he thinks it's the police, but it's one of his friends saying, look, we have to get down to Dublin. There's a big Palestinian solidarity march. We need to go. And then he said, A door being battered and hammered away always reminds me of British Army raids. I felt relieved that it was just a friend doing the hammering. My thoughts drifted to those in occupied Palestine, hearing similar noise, followed by the voices of fascist Israeli soldiers in jack boots, then gunfire. In the wake of the visit, a child or another loved one dead. I would make it to Dublin even if I had to walk. And he says, things in Palestine have got so bad that even the Pope has condemned the Israeli government. But the thought crossed my mind that this was more to do with the fact that with nowhere else to escape the murderous Israeli assault, the Palestinians were seeking refuge in churches. Had the Vatican conducted another sordid deal with fascism for which it is renowned, shoot all you want, but not on their property? That's a really good one. Then he makes comparisons there to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. He says that I wasn't even born yet when all this was taking place, but watching events in Palestine today, I can see at first hand what it was like for those brave Jewish people in the Warsaw Ghetto. Innocent people under fascist and racist attack, and yet they resist. And we watch this, we know that Hitler never really died, but is on the march, having donned the mask of those he sought to exterminate. He is writing the hated number on the arms of the Palestinians. What genocide has he planned for the Ramallah Ghetto? So it's a really powerful piece there. Well, what are your thoughts on it? It's like, I'm approaching the subject kind of nervously as well, because I've had interactions in the past where someone said, no, that's taboo. You can't make that comparison whatsoever. Right. Yeah.
I've been through my own phase on this of a period in time when I thought about whether it's counterproductive, not because I disagree with it. So it's very interesting. He makes the Warsaw Ghetto comparison. I've heard that a lot about October 7th as well. He's writing in the context of the Second Intifada, right? And so I agree totally with that. And I think it's helpful, but I think that there's this Zionist campaign to equate anti-Semitism or to make these phrases seem anti-Semitic has been quite effective. And so I think a lot of times it can turn people off at a level of rhetoric in different places. My older approach to it would be, why do we need to make the comparison to Nazis? Like that specifically seems to be, kind of focusing on the Jewish people and inverting something. And, that it might be better to make other comparisons or a broader comparison to fascism or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think that the problem is that it becomes difficult at a certain point not to bring in that comparison. And I think, some of my Palestinian friends, their view on it is basically like that there is this kind of irony of it that, you have a people, many of whom did experience the Holocaust, who then are enacting those same things upon other populations. And so that there is a kind of historical irony to that, but there's, of course, also that, some of them learned these forms of repression and violence through their own experiences with that kind of violence. And so, I don't think it's taboo, in my opinion. And I think that certain comparisons can be helpful. And I've actually shifted my own opinion kind of from, I used to just refrain from any of those comparisons because I didn't feel like they were that helpful or necessary. I think one problem I have with it a little bit is also that colonialism often takes these really grotesque forms, and that Palestine specifically is a colonial context. And so making a comparison to Europe and the genocide that happens in Europe is kind of convenient for, I know this translates differently in the US and Europe, but like white people, it's like, why don't we talk about the genocide of the indigenous people in the United States, or talk about the Herero or Nama genocides in, what's today Namibia, or the Congo and King Leopold. And then obviously in the Irish context, you could talk about the famine and a lot of other histories of colonial violence within Ireland as well. So it's interesting to me that that's the example, but I do understand it. I do understand that it is partly based also in this kind of historical irony of it, which is really, I think, quite tragic in a lot of ways,
Definitely.
But it's also, Israel has done what it has done, because it's been allowed to also by the West, right?
Yeah.
So that because the United States and the UK, Germany, and other countries have allowed Israel to continue to operate this way and to take it, especially in these last 16 months, to such an extreme that that's why they do it. There's no one that's holding them accountable within the West. And I think that's where, in some ways, the comparison also with the Nazis, it becomes a little bit challenging too, because at least with the Nazis, everybody understood, not everybody, but a lot of people understood we had to fight this, whereas with Israel, it's like, no, the United States is just supplying them weapons the whole time to do this.
Yeah. There's such a back in there.
A lot of thoughts about it in my head right now, but I also understand it, I think, from Hughes's context and from an Irish context. I mean, I know Ireland gets branded as anti-Semitic anyways because of its support for Palestine, and there is some Irish anti-Semitism, as there's anti-Semitism in places. But it's interesting. I don't know whether that's as culturally taboo. In the United States, I'd say it's been very culturally taboo, and there's been a lot of work to promote these versions of anti-Semitism that basically say it's anti-Semitic to make any comparison to the Holocaust, or it's anti-Semitic to talk about Jewish people as colonizers or this or that. And it's like, that actually is anti-Semitic. It's the idea that we can't talk about violence of a Jewish state because the people in it are Jewish. That this becomes some kind of taboo. We can't have real discussion about it. I mean, that's its own version of anti-Semitism in my view. So, yeah,
I'd agree with that. And I don't think it's really that taboo over here, definitely, because you see it on a lot of the marches. You'll hear this chants and stuff about that. But as you just said, Ireland gets accused of being anti-Semitic a lot. Just as you said that, there was an article yesterday in the Irish Times. Ireland doesn't have a very big Jewish population, but they have some loud Zionist voices, and they went to the newspaper and they're like, the president is going to be given the keynote speech at the Holocaust Remembrance Day in Dublin. This guy is an anti-Semite. All he's done is say, Israel is tearing international law to shreds. This is a humanitarian crisis. This cannot be allowed. All he's done is criticize the state's actions. But as you said, the big push to make any kind of criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, I think it's the IHRA definition. That's really, they're trying to get that passed and have it be a reality where now people think I can't speak out against genocide, or I can't even call it a genocide because is that anti-Semitic? Different things like that. A lot of the news sites wouldn't even call it a genocide up until very recently because they were afraid to use the word. Yeah.
No, this is all true. Yeah, it is the IHRA definition. And it's everywhere. And like in my state where I live, it's illegal for colleges to divest from Israel. That they've passed laws to make it illegal and anti-Semitic to just do divestment, which is crazy. Why can't an institution choose how it wants to invest its money based on some set of moral principles? I mean, I know that that's fraught in all kinds of ways in a capitalist system in general, but we have these histories of divestment from South Africa and everything else. And it's not even allowed in a lot of American states because specifically Zionists have, worked to get these laws passed to make it illegal to do that, to counteract the strength of the BDS, campaign. So
that's right.
Yeah. So there are some threads I wanted to kind of talk about within his writing. So there's a little bit of what I would characterize as kind of a libertarian socialism, or he's interested in these principles of, democratic principles or principles of liberty, rights and individual rights, things like this. And a strong sense also of a kind of moral underpinning to many of his writings, So regarding the what I see as the sort of libertarian impulse, he has some critiques of vanguardism that show up in his work, as well as discussions of, party censorship. So this is one of the interesting things, as you mentioned earlier, he's brave in terms of speaking out around certain things. And he acknowledges in his writings that certain writings that he had sent in to be published with certain, like, I guess, party affiliated papers and magazines and things like this were highly censored. So his discussions of the party censoring is also a lack of kind of a democratic space for dissenting views within Republican politics. So that's one of the things that he works on, I think, at one point, is developing some of these organs where within what's the broad camp that is Republican politics in Ireland, that you could have disagreement with whatever the dominant, whether it's Sinn Féin, or leadership are doing. And there's also a kind of democratic socialist or social democratic kind of perspective regarding, what he calls for a social democratic state in Ireland, which I know like James Connolly had a similar kind of, approach that way. And I guess just to be clear on the distinction I'm making, he's not calling for a one-party communist Ireland. So there's a distinction a little bit in terms of how he looks at socialism versus some variants of like Marxist-Leninism that would say, we want a one-party state as a dictatorship of the proletariat and so on. And then on kind of the moral component, I'm thinking about his piece. It's called The Terrifying Power of Life and Death, and his decision not to let Sean McKenna die, which is a very, important kind of decision within his life and amid the hunger strikes, for context, as well as his discussions of the morality that drove him to show up for oppressed people at rallies and so on, which we've talked about that. So talk a little bit about some, I know I said a lot of different things, but some of these aspects of his politics from your perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I was reading the notes, the big thing that jumped out at me is there can sometimes be this confusion around the statement. It was often put out in like IRA documents or Sinn Féin policy papers that our aim is a 32-county democratic socialist republic. You'll see that sometimes. They're not in favor of democratic socialism. They're in favor of democracy and socialism. So sometimes people kind of can't really make that distinction. Regards the censorship, yeah, 100%. And that's why we had a few veteran Republicans write in the foreword to the book. And one of them was Anthony McIntyre. And he's himself and Brendan founded these alternative kind of organs for dissent, as he called them. They later became something called the Pensive Quill, which is a website. And it's mainly ran by Anthony McIntyre. He was actually in Say Nothing as well. I think he's called Mackers or something like that, but they don't actually call him because he's still alive and still active. But yeah, the censorship definitely was there, and to a certain extent still happens as well. Like you'll often see, well, not often, but occasionally you'll see a news story where a Sinn Féin member would speak out on something and then had a knock on the door. Like they just showed up to this person's house and said, "What are you doing? What are you saying? You need to not do that." Like that's crazy, crazy stuff. But also, up until very recently, I think it was 2016, Sinn Féin operated under democratic centralism that was enshrined into the constitution. And the people in charge of Sinn Féin, it wasn't really a kind of central committee. That didn't exist. It was something called an Ard Carlia, so like the High Committee. And the great thing about democratic centralism is if you have solid people in there, they'll be like, yeah, you can speak out against this, but if it goes against consensus after a vote is taken, no, you need to just go along with the party line. Let's say you have a leadership which is compromised, i.e. through British informers or different things like that. And that's when it gets, that's the problem with it. Like, and also like at times there could be a bit of a Machiavellian kind of atmosphere there, that like what we say goes and that's it, which is kind of the tragic place that ended up was the likes of Joseph O'Connor, who was shot supposedly by the Provisional IRA after the ceasefire. So yeah, he definitely has a humanitarian feel to his works. He's on the ground. He really cares about his community because he is working class. Up until his death, he lived in Divis Tower in Belfast, which is like a high-rise flat complex. He was very simple, lived easily, And he would even speak out for other veterans as well. He mentions in one of his writings about a man called Kieran Nugent, and he was the first Republican prisoner who refused to wear a prison uniform after criminalization. So at a certain point in the struggle, Irish prisoners had essentially POW status. Like, these guys are prisoners of conscience, prisoners of war. They don't have to wear a prison uniform. They don't have to do prison labor, different things like that. But Thatcher got rid of that. And then the young man, 17 years of age, Kieran Nugent, he was arrested and they handed him this uniform. And he famously said, "You're going to have to nail that to my back. I'm not wearing that." And he's revered as well in Republican circles. But quite tragically, after the ceasefire, he developed a bit of a drinking problem, and he would often be seen by himself, like drinking by the river, and just needed help. He needed, like, comrades to step in and say, "Look, we're going to give you a hand here. We're going to get you back on your feet." And Brendan kind of attacks the Sinn Féin leadership when he says, these people used to call him the river rat, and he used to laugh about him when he was drinking by a river, but he was a veteran who gave his life for the struggle. Like, he really cared about people. You could tell that he has such admiration for Kieran Nugent there, and even the other POWs who are earning absolutely nothing, after they get out of prison, doing this heavy labor. Like, imagine being in prison on a prison diet, then you come out and you need to be on a building site 12 hours a day. There's a real humanitarian nature to his writing. Definitely, I agree with you there.
Yeah, no, thank you for all of that. So, it's interesting. Like, I saw when this book came out, I really didn't actually know that much about Brendan Hughes. And it was actually watching the Hulu series that I was like, wait a minute. I was like, oh, it's his writings. Okay, like, let me go back and read this book. And so I hope that the series does, draw people to actually engage a little bit more with Brendan's writings and this great collection you all have put together. So I know we talked beforehand and you say you haven't seen the series yet. I'm sure you've at least heard of the book or like loosely familiar with that. But, I think my reflections on it, as I shared a little bit with you before we started, is like, I think it's pretty good on the whole. It's a very well-made series. It's well acted, well written. It goes into some, like, a lot of the actions. It goes into some of the escapes, and it goes into the hunger strikes, and then it goes into the 90s period and the peace process. And it definitely takes the side of, I would say, of Brandon and of Dolores Price in terms of being critical of Gerry Adams and Sinn Féin in that period. It does get a little bit bogged down, I would say, in a couple of different ways. But what I had written here is that one of the things I found in the series is this sense in it of Gerry Adams as a kind of betrayer of his comrades, or as someone who ordered the deeds, which in particular in the series focuses quite a bit about the disappearance of Jean McConville in particular. And it shows Adams as someone who now reaps the political rewards of the armed struggle publicly, but will not be held accountable for allegedly ordering disappearances and so on. And, I'm wondering if there are things, and I know since you haven't seen it, you may not be able to respond to this directly, but you think books or series like Say Nothing leave out or misdirect people in any important ways? One of the questions I had, and a lot of us had as we were watching it, is like, because you expect these films to be propagandistic and bad generally, and so we were like, this isn't so bad. Why did they make this? What are they trying to get across in this? I don't know that you can kind of speak to it since you haven't seen it yet, but I wonder if you have thoughts on kind of how maybe you've seen figures like Brendan portrayed that don't really get to the politics of Brendan. Maybe it would be a better way to say it.
I know, talking to someone who's close to the family, that Brendan's family on the whole are quite happy with how he's portrayed. I know one issue I do have with it. A friend of mine watched it and he says that they conveniently, now listen, I just need to preface this, that death is awful. Someone being killed is horrible. But obviously they conveniently left out the fact that Jean McConville was found to have a British Army radio in her bedroom. And apparently, as the story goes, I've read about this interaction that she was told to cease. Like, could you not do that? Like, in a very direct way. But it was found that she continued. And so that's one issue I have there. She was like a British Army informer. I think the show doesn't mention that whatsoever.
Yeah, so what it shows, what it leaves is, and the book does this as well. I haven't finished the book, but I've read the first half, which kind of deals with her capture and disappearance and stuff. And they present that she didn't participate, right? So she didn't support like the basic things that the people in the flats would do to support the armed struggle. So she wouldn't pass the guns down the windows and stuff like that to get them away. So she was clear to like the other Republicans, like she wanted nothing to do with it. But then there's also this scene that they put in the film where she goes to the aid of a British police officer or British Army, who's been shot in the housing complex. And she gives him a pillow and she's like comforting him and stuff like that. And she gets seen by Irish militants doing this, IRA members doing this. And to me, like, I mean, and this is where, you know, as you say, like anybody being killed or, you know, is awful. And one of the really, I think, difficult things about that specific circumstance is what happens to the children in the instance, because she's a single mother. And so they kind of become split up and become wards of the state and stuff like that. And so obviously this is horrible. But there's a way that, you know, as I was watching it, I'm like, even within the film, which does, you're right, they don't deal at all with the radio or any direct proof that she is an informant. But it's clear that that's what the IRA thinks, is that she's an informant.
Right.
And to me, you know, if you're in an armed struggle like that and you really think, you feel like you have strong reason to suspect that this person's an informant, like, well, I'm not going to like condone it. I don't really condemn it. Like, I don't,
Right.
To me, it wasn't one of those things where I was like, I'm going to get really hung up about this. Obviously, it's a tragedy. It's terrible for the family.
Yeah.
I get that. But you're in the context of an armed struggle, and, you know, she could have just, even in the series, if I'm just like putting on my, like, what could she do differently? It's like, she could have just kept her distance and not gone out and helped this, you know, British Army person. And so there were definitely, at least the series does enough to at least present that like there's some cause for the IRA members to be suspicious of her being an informant. But yeah, if that's true, that she actually had a military radio and stuff like that, I mean, that it is more extensive, and that's quite damning evidence that they don't show in the series itself. I'll give my two critiques. So that's one critique, is like, one, just centering around the disappearances, it becomes a way of like making that more important than the politics of what people were struggling around. Like, the disappearance are a bad thing that happened, and, you know, part of what they raise is that Jerry Adams perhaps should have been accountable for it, but he wasn't, and so then other people became kind of accountable for it by default. You know, to me, that's not as interesting, I guess, to some extent. What I would say is that, and yeah, I understand why Brendan Hughes' family would feel, you know, pretty good about it, because I think that Brendan Hughes is presented well in the series.
Yeah.
But I do think that one of the things that happens is his difference of opinion with Jerry Adams becomes more about the fact that he sees Jerry Adams as just kind of capitalizing personally off of the armed struggle and launching his career on the back of the sacrifices that Brendan and others made. But there's not as much, I don't really remember any point in the series where they go into the political disagreements that they might have, or like the criticism around the Army Suit Brigade, the criticism around these capitalist exploiters, and so what you miss to some degree is, I think it's easy to classify somebody as a sellout politically. That kind of, we all kind of don't like politicians, right?
Yeah.
But it's a little bit different to get then into like, what are the actual politics of that critique? It's not just a critique that they participated in parliamentary politics. It's deeper than that. And I think that that's probably, if I had a real criticism of it, and I'm not surprised because it's a mainstream product. It's not going to be like our hero is a socialist and, Jerry Adams, not so much maybe, but that's the part that I think you get from this book that you don't get from the series, is like, what are the contents of Brendan's critiques beyond this guy's a sellout?
Yeah, essentially. Yeah. I agree with all of that. Also, I think a point of contention with some veteran Republicans, especially people who have done time, that a lot of them would think, we don't shy away from this. This is who we are, and we've experienced this, and these are the things that we've done, and we suffered for it. I'm in a Facebook group with a lot of these older people who had either been on the blanket or had, done time. And I remember some guy, he sums it up really well, that when he was talking about the no wash protests, that's the term that they use. They wouldn't use the other term. It's a bit disrespectful. Well, this is from a veteran. He said, someone was like, do you ever regret? And he said, I lived 2 years of my life up to my neck in piss and shit, and I'd do it again in the morning, all for the Republic. So that's the kind of mindset some of these people have. This is what I've done. These are the things I've had to deal with, and I don't shy away from this. I think a lot of those people would have issue with Adams saying, I neither confirm nor deny that I have ever been a member of the Provisional IRA. But at the same time, kind of, selling mugs and stuff that say Chucky our lads, all of these like little quirky military stuff in Sinn Féin shops around the country. It's kind of, I could see why people would be a little pissed off about that, Like, a lot of these people have lost years of their life, and then here's this guy saying, no, I'm not saying no, but I'm not saying I did it, and is kind of like pointing to it at the same time.
Yeah, that is, I think, a poignant part of the series to some extent, because I think, Dolores clearly has a little bit different, politics and all of that than Brendan does, but like, they both sacrificed a lot, as did, I'm trying to think of Dolores' sister's name.
Marion. She's still alive, by the way, and still active in Republican circles.
Yeah, and she's great they do a good job portraying her in the series too. Like, they all do sacrifice a lot. And Jerry, who, as they portray in the series, that, it's funny, there's a disclaimer on every episode of like, right, Jerry Adams, has always maintained that he was not a member of the IRA and he didn't do any of these things, but, they portray him as a leader, as a section leader. And that's part of the frustration, is it's like, that they do show is that, Brendan and Dolores and Mar, like, they sacrifice for these things, and on actions that he was involved in or signed off on or knew of, etc. And that now he just denies it all. And so then they're all left to kind of, having been through all of those things, but also not having any kind of security or, which is a similar thing in the U.S. context. I mean, with like, Black Panthers or Black Liberation Army members, as we talk about, like, there's groups of us and folks that like support basically these like mutual aid kind of funds for them to do stuff and things, and to have money that they can access on certain things, because it's like, they don't have any pension, they don't have any, they weren't able to save up money as they were engaged in these activities and things like that, and now they're elders and they have needs, and they end up having to like go to the internet to like raise funds for themselves, like GoFundMe type stuff and things like that. And, then you have people who were maybe in the Black Panther Party or whatever, but like leave it and become just a sort of mainstream politician or, get book deals or things like this and have some kind of career off of it. It's a complicated thing, but a lot of times the people who are the most militant and who make the most sacrifices are the ones that get left with the least, whereas the people who have some kind of relationship with these struggles but are able to like basically build a career, kind of launch a career off of it, can live much more comfortably, right? And
definitely.
And so yeah.
It's unfortunate, isn't it, that it seems that grifters have always been around on the left. We're looking 50, 60 years in the past, and there was people looking to capitalize on this. I wonder what the equivalent of launching, I don't know, like a big, huge book that's really expensive was at the time. I wonder what they were up to. What was their grift?
And it's interesting too, because that's part of those dynamics we talked about earlier, like thinking about leadership and counterinsurgency. And I don't think everybody that does this is intending to sell out their struggle, or like a lot of times they think that they're furthering the cause through other means. Nonetheless, it creates these, understandably, it just creates these fractures and these divisions when you have people that are able to, to monetize it, I guess, to use a common, term, or to create political capital off of it, while others just are not and are left working for sub-minimum wages doing construction or whatever else, and it's a kind of sinister way, I think, of counterinsurgency that just has to do also with the fact that we do live under capitalism, right? And so it's also, people make decisions about their own livelihoods, I guess, at a certain extent. But yeah.
I suppose as well, one thing we didn't mention, like,
go ahead.
I suppose, we're getting kind of, like down and a bit on a depressive note as well. But I suppose that's where he was as well in the 2000s, from definitely up until 2003 or 4. But then you can kind of notice towards the end of the book as well. It doesn't mention it in the book, I'm not too sure, but he visited Cuba. He went to Cuba. There's photos of him with a Che Guevara t-shirt. And there's another example of his internationalism as well. And it's only really in this time, like, that we have 2 writings that we know of that he did in the 80s. It's only really in this time when he starts to write, when he's older, he's a bit reflective. But you can kind of tell that he didn't lose faith. He engaged in Palestine solidarity. That was his big outlet, and his writing as well. And currently at the moment, I'm translating this into Irish, and that's one of my projects in Iscra. And it's just an absolute pleasure to work on this and to have worked with some of these people as well in the forward. Like, we have one of the hunger strikers, by the way, Tony O'Hara. He wrote one of the blurbs. It's on the back here. Tony O'Hara. He was one of the hunger strikers who died. It's just been such a pleasure to work on an amazing book of an amazing man who, he had his ups and downs, but then towards the end of his life, he kept faith. And now we have all these brilliant writings as well. And this can be used for political education, definitely. And I know I said it earlier, but I seem to always kind of like the working class revolutionaries, the ones who kind of came from nothing, who know the struggle. They don't have the big fancy words that everyone else has, but you could give this to your grandmother and she'd be able to understand what he's talking about. It's not quite like, I don't know, Capitals. The chapter on the infamous chapter we all know.
Yeah. That's funny because I've recently been reading Capital, and but I gravitate towards that as well. We're doing a study group right now on George Jackson in the United States, who I think of as like one of those types of revolutionaries as well, where, he's a militant but he's also very well read, clearly. And he's a theorist, but like, things are very well kind of grounded. And, as he speaks about things, he's a great writer too.
Is that Blood in My Eye? Is it?
Yeah, that's what.
My partner keeps telling me to read that.
You should. Yeah, it's great, and there's a kind of militant clarity, and I think that you see that with Hughes too. Like you say, it is a very you can tell that he's not somebody that has a PhD nonetheless, I think that his insights are poignant. As I said, it has a really, not all Marxists or socialists does the kind of moral component come through. And I know there's debates around that on the left, but I think probably because of this genocide in the last 16 months, I'm also sometimes drawn of like, we need that too. Like you have to be able to connect with people in different ways. And, I think that's really strong. And you can just see the kind of conscience, right, of like somebody who's a good person and who acts upon the things that he believes in. And yeah, I mean, I think it to the point too about like it getting a little bit depressing. I mean, I do think that there is like that aspect to it, but there is also the piece that you're saying of like, he's always kind of trying to find as time goes on, different things to engage in and different ways to be politically active and involved, even as the organization or the party that he's a part of that he comes up in, he doesn't really see himself within that structure the way that it is as much anymore. He never abandons the cause of Irish republicanism, and he never abandons his socialist ideas and his internationalism. And, so that's one of the things too, I guess I would say, is his principles, right? Like he really does hold to his principles and use his principles to hold others to account to what he believes they agree to as well. Their principles should be. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why the cover art, if anyone's interested in buying this, it's on iskrabooks.org and you'll be able to order. And the cover art is beautiful. It's, I'll go into like, I kind of, myself and my partner kind of thought up this idea. So how you see him here is he's chained to a tree and he has his rifle in his hand and there's a bird above him. This is modeled off of there's a figure in Irish mythology called Cú Chulainn, who's a brave warrior right to the end. And how he died was that he was succumbing to his wounds. He had his spear in his hand and his shield, but he ties himself to a tree so he can face his enemies and die on his feet while defending his native land. And the crow is a symbol of another figure in Irish mythology, the Morrigan. She's sometimes considered like associated with death. But I just thought that it was an apt comparison, Brendan Hughes to Cú Chulainn, unwavering till the end. He stood firm. He didn't give up his principles, and you could definitely say he's the modern Cú Chulainn, although he was a really modest man. Would never think that whatsoever. And the beautiful thing is as well is in the background on the copy, you'll see mountains there. And that's where Cú Chulainn died, was these mountains called the Cooley Mountains, just on the border between Ulster and the north of Leinster, Louth and County Down. And that's actually where Brendan's ashes are spread, around those same mythological hills. It's really, really beautiful. I think it just sums him up as a person as well. Romantic, as he said, a good man as well, and true to the end. I have to shout out Ben from Iscra as well. He's the one who puts this stuff together. The man is just a magician. You have an image in your mind, he'll come back with something beautiful like that.
Yeah, we've had Ben on the show before.
We
had to talk about one of the conversations we did on the Stalin book that they did the Domenico Lacerdo. But yeah, great. He does great work, and it is a beautiful cover. And yeah, just to remind people too, yes, buy it. Also, if you want to check it out and just see it, like you can download the free PDF copy too from iskrabooks.org and just see what it's about. But I definitely encourage people to purchase it to support the work that you all do there. So yeah, anything else that you wanted to share? I know you've talked a little bit about some upcoming projects, but maybe you want to say just a little bit more about that, or anything else that you want to share as we close out.
Oh yeah, you can find Iskra on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter. I'm not saying the other stupid name. We're on Blue Sky now as well. I know people are migrating over there. I don't know, are we on Red Note just yet? But we are on TikTok. But I know we'll see what happens in America.
I can't figure out how to log into Red Note. I've tried. I haven't figured it out yet. I need to get someone to help me. But yeah,
it's hilarious. Yeah. I'll continue to plug. So we have recently announced an imprint, so an Irish language imprint. The Irish language is something which is really kind of put to the side in the struggle for freedom in Ireland. It's always, let's unite the country, get the Brits out, and then we'll figure out the reclamation of our native language when that's all done, where that's not how it works. Need to be hand in hand. So in that vein, we've launched an imprint. We're going to be publishing radical Irish texts in the Irish language. And one of the first projects is going to be The Dark, all in the Irish language, because the inspiration for that really came, I was at the Derry book fair, the radical book fair in Derry in the north, and this man said, "Why have you no books in Irish?" And I'm an Irish speaker, I'm a Gaeilgeoir. And I was like, that's criminal that we don't have any books in Irish. So the good folks in Iscra said we can support you on that. Yeah, there's exciting things coming our way, so watch this space, as they say.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been great, and really appreciate the conversation. Love the book. Encourage people to go out and buy it. Especially if anybody I encourage to do that. But if you watch Say Nothing and you want to actually learn a little bit more about the politics of Brendan Hughes, this is the best place to do so too. So I'll encourage folks to do that if they saw that show as well. And check out that show. I'd be interested to hear what other people did think about it. I think it's good to have, media that at least doesn't present the IRA as just a bunch of, deranged terrorists or whatever, and actually deals with the politics of the struggle. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much for having me on. This is an absolute pleasure to just yap away for a few hours.
Yeah, thank you. No, it was my pleasure. All right. Have a good one.